Okay, everybody, we're going to get started here. I appreciate everyone coming out. I know it's right at for a minute past 5 o'clock, but we're going to, as I always start these meetings, we have a lot to get to, so I wanted to try and make sure we stay on time this evening, and we do have some guest speakers, so lucky for everyone, you don't have to listen to me all night like our previous meetings. I heard that, Ralph. Yes, thank you. I'm Matt Kleisico with Michael Baker International. We're the firm assisting the town with this general plan update. And so hopefully seeing some familiar faces and good turnout, that this evening's discussion on the general plan is going to be all focused on open space. And so as part of that conversation, like we've done in the past, we're going to walk you through some foundational information so that we all kind of understand where we're coming from when we talk about open space. And then towards the end of the meeting, we'll break out into exercises in the back of the room like we have in other meetings to collect some more specific information that the project team can use when we're going back to actually putting pen to paper. One other kind of housekeeping item that I'll share this evening is we are live streaming this meeting via the town's YouTube channel. So unlike some of our prior meetings, we're going to live stream and record this one so that any residents that weren't able to join us this evening can go back and see the entire meeting. Now, because of that, we have one mobile mic, and so we're going to try and run around when we get to question and answer period. I'll kind of run over and ask you to maybe hold your question so that everybody can hear and pick it up on the audio. And then we're going to have to give some time for the whoever's answering the question to respond. So a couple of those items to keep in mind. As far as just getting into the introduction for tonight's meeting, what I've put up on this slide is just a synopsis of a lot of stuff that we've heard up to this point for the general plan. So we've conducted various surveys, whether it's the community-wide general plan survey that we pushed out or the individual surveys for each community workshop. Within those, we've heard different types of feedback. So the overall survey, we heard that why do you choose to live in Carefree? Well, 73%, the second highest total, talked about proximity to natural open space. What are some of the current issues the town should be addressing? Natural open space and resource preservation. 90% of respondents said that that was essential to very important. And then what are, rather than current issues, what are long-term issues that the town must address as part of this general plan? And their open space preservation was one of the top responses at 81%. So why are we having a meeting just on open space? We've heard from the public loud and clear that it's very important. Now, when we talk about looking at the general plan itself, as we've worked through in prior meetings, the general plan is a document that has a series of elements or topics, and within each of those topics are specific goals or policies to help support that element. So when we look at the current or existing general plan and the open space element, you see those 4 goals that comprise, in essence, the open space element. And there's a series of policies that are associated with each of those goals. So you can see when we asked in some of our prior meetings and online, how do these goals, how do you react, if you will, to these goals? We got a lot of support of keeping them. So one of the things we're going to be working on tonight is building on when we asked at our prior meetings, tell us more about what we're looking for when we're talking about open space and why it's so important. So we heard, yes, plenty of comments about preserve the 48-acre trust trust land piece. And we have state land here this afternoon to talk to us a little bit more about their formal process. So I wanted everyone to have the benefit of hearing from state land directly. When we're talking about this 48 acres, we might as well have the agency that's responsible for managing that land tell us more about their process so we can be more informed about where we go from here. And so we also heard in some of those prior meetings, what type of activities or amenities do you want to see in these open space locations? And we're seeing some look at it as more active, and some look at the open space as more passive. And so that's another aspect of open space that we want to be thoughtful about, is not only when we're all saying, yes, we're on the same page about open space, but how are we using that open space, or how do we envision using it? If your view of open space is different than your view, then we need to understand what that means and how that is addressed in the general plan. And then last, we start to talk about preserve other locations or restrict certain types of development. Well, yes, we heard about the 48 acres, but Carefree has other locations in town. And so that's another part of this evening's conversation, is to understand, are there other areas in town that we should be paying attention to relative to open space, and not simply hyper-focus on one particular property, because this is a general plan for the town overall. So all of those things, when you might have come to this meeting going, okay, what more could we talk about open space? Well, there's a lot more that we can talk about in terms of defining what that means for the town. So here is a little bit more of, like I said, a map of what we know regarding open space. So we know the feedback we've collected, but we also recognize that we have the land use plan, which is on the top, that has an open space designation. We have the zoning map, which is on the smaller map on the bottom, which also defines what type of development can happen on certain parcels. So all of that ends up leading to this updated map that we're going to be using for some of our exercise this evening, to show us where the different types of property and or open space exists. So we, I don't think this will work on the screen. Yeah. We have some areas of different types of open space, right? I've heard from residents talk about how we identify golf courses as open space. But then we also have the cemetery as open space. We have some land to the north of the town limits that falls within the Desert Foothills Land Trust. The town actually owns some parcels of land up there, the yellow locations. You see the blue location as the Black Mountain Preserve. There's some additional parcels near the Black Mountain Preserve that are either administered by the Foothills Land Trust or owned by Maricopa County. So again, when we start talking about what we know about open space, we want to also look at geographically what we know about open space, and what the ownership of lands are, and what that means, and how that impacts whether or how future uses of the land could support open space. So all of that, what I'm trying to get to, is the purpose of tonight's meeting. And the purpose of tonight's meeting is to, one, what does open space mean to you? Again, we're going to work through what it is that we view as open space when we're talking about it, what open space areas are most important in Carefree. So looking at that map to understand if there's other areas that are of interest or value, beyond just talking a little bit about the 48-acre state trust piece. And then how do we plan for a future that addresses open space in Carefree? So we're talking about open space is important. We're talking about where or how it could be provided. Then finally, we need the words, right, to back that up and support it. And so the last exercise will be, again, looking at the goals and policies of the open space element in greater detail to understand. Because at this point, we're getting a lot of feedback that says open space, as it's identified in the general plan relative to goals or policies, is fairly supportive, that the way the goals and policies are generally outlined are consistent with a lot of the input we're getting. So we need to start asking ourselves, well, what is it about the general plan that isn't getting us to that place that we want to be relative to this important aspect of the community? So with those purposes in mind, what I want to do first is invite Karen Dada up from the Arizona State Land Department. And Karen's going to walk through for all of us, give a little tutorial on how trust land is, how it came to be, how it's managed, and then how the process goes a little bit on how it is ultimately put up for auction at certain points in time. So with that, I wanted to actually mention, I apologize, that we're going to try and keep the clock tight here so that we can make sure we get to everyone's input and feedback. So we do have some timelines here that we're going to try and stick to. But if we have to keep the conversation going and the meeting going, I'm happy to have side conversations with anybody if there's a certain topic that we didn't spend enough time on. But we just want to make sure that we get to all of the exercises this evening to get the benefit of everyone's time and feedback. So with that, I'll turn it over to Karen. And after Karen's presentation, we'll have some question and answer period. So if you wouldn't mind, unless it's a point of clarification, hold your questions to the end, and then Karen or I or any other staff that's more appropriate will try and address those questions.
Should I point anywhere or just?
Yeah, you can point anywhere.
Okay.
It's just the laser won't come on.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. I am Karen Dada with the State Land Department. I manage our planning and engineering section at State Lands, and I see some familiar faces, so bear with me if you've heard this before. It's a story as old as our state, so hopefully it won't be too dry for those of you who have heard this before. But tonight I'm going to just cover some basic principles of what state trust land is, because it's often misunderstood in terms of what the purpose of the land is. I'm going to show you where it is in Carefree proper, talk about what's happening in your area, and then just kind of walk you through some of the resources we have within our agency as well. So state trust land, when Arizona became a state, the federal government recognized that our new state needed a revenue resource to fund essential public services such as schools, hospitals, prisons, even the government itself. And so the federal government, an act of Congress, allocated 10 million acres of what was federal land to the state of Arizona to manage as a trust, as an asset to fund those resources. So this land is the asset that funds the state trust. So just like if any of you have retirement funds or trust accounts and you have assets in stocks or bonds, the land is the asset for this trust. So today, of that 10 million acres, we have 9.2. So it was remaining 9.2 million. So it was set up and intended to be a perpetual trust to fund our state's needs for those services. You can see we have that 10 million acre or 9.2 remaining. This shows current state trust land. It's scattered throughout the state of Arizona. With concentrations in the Sun Corridor area up in Yavapai County as well. So just to give you a perspective of our state as a whole, about 28% is in tribal reservation land. About 42% is in federal holdings. That's the BLM, it's the Park Service, it's the National Forests, and other federal agency holdings. There's about 17% private, and there's 12%, almost 13% state trust. And that number, of course, is a dwindling number. The private number might change hands, but it's not likely that that number is ever going to change. So if you're thinking about economic development and where our state has a path to grow and provide economic development opportunity, like you see with TSMC, which was actually state trust land, there's not a lot of land for our state to have opportunities for residential and economic development, and the trust is in combination with the private land for that opportunity. Every single acre has an underlying beneficiary, and that was assigned at statehood. So we actually have a map. I'll show you later how to access that. If you look at the map, and I actually don't know who is the underlying beneficiary for the Carefree, we call it internally the Carefree 50. I'm not sure who that beneficiary is because we are a fiduciary agency. And so we don't do anything on behalf of any one particular beneficiary. So we do it just for the trust as a whole, not for a particular beneficiary. But by far, I'm going to have about an 89% chance of being right if I say the Carefree 50 is a K-12 beneficiary. And that's not necessarily Carefree schools or North Phoenix schools, it's our state schools. So I'll explain a bit how that goes, how that works. But we also have 12 other beneficiaries, the 3 universities, the School for the Deaf and Blind, the Pioneers Home, our state hospitals, state prisons. So there are all those beneficiaries for when we sell or lease the land. They are the beneficiaries of that revenue. Because these lands are held in trust for a distinct set of beneficiaries, as I said, the trust land differs drastically from any other public land. This is not land for the good of the Arizona public as a whole, at large. Our public, the Arizona residents, benefit by the services that are being funded by the trust. So it's not public land for the use of the general public like our state parks or U.S. Forest Service land. So it's always better to think of this land as private land that you might hold. Oh, that's hard to see. Sorry about that. So we can't sell. We have significant rules. They're written in state statute, in our state constitution, in our Enabling Act, and of course through case law. And I've heard one time, nobody sued us more than our beneficiaries. So they're keeping an eye on what we do as an agency. So I'll just read these. I usually don't like to read through the slides, but since those are a bit hard to see, I'll say the state trust lands can't be sold for less than fair market value as determined by appraisal. So we can't, if we have a fire district or you know, the Department of Fire and Forestry Management is a sister agency of ours. They needed a place for a fire station and, you know, an office for themselves. They have to buy that at public auction, just like anybody else would. And if it's a developable piece of land, there could be bidding. So our auctions in Maricopa County are held in our offices, but if we're going to sell land up in Yavapai County, that's being sold literally on the courthouse steps. And you have a paddle and you bid. Land leases, so a lot of how we manage this 9.2 million acres with a staff of 90 people is by grazing and agricultural leases for a lot of cases in the rural Arizona. So our ranchers, and it's checkerboarded a lot in rural Arizona, so our ranchers have larger private holdings that are intermingled with ours, and they're paying a lease to us for grazing or farming that land, and that lease revenue goes directly as annual revenue to the beneficiaries. When we sell the land, the money goes to the state treasurer, and they put that into what's called the permanent fund, and then the beneficiaries get, just like a trust works, they get the revenue, the income from that permanent fund as part of their budget. We employ less than 100 staff who are responsible for all aspects, We have sales and leasing agents. We have a whopping staff of 3 planners and 2 engineers to look at all planning and zoning cases going on adjacent to our land and to actively plan our land. We have 2 trespass agents for the whole state. And we do not have police authority. We can't go out and police land like park rangers could. So we're not set up functionally as a recreation management agency. And most of our processes and timelines, as I said earlier, are dictated by our Enabling Act, the Constitution. So we work slowly. We have mandated, processes that we have to follow that would take sometimes an act of the legislature, sometimes an act of the voters, or sometimes literally an act of Congress to change the way we do some of the things we do. Again, every dollar earned goes into the trust. We do not see it as an agency. We're general fund agency, just like, ADOT or any other agency that is within the state. So we're dependent on the budget being approved, at the legislature and signed by the governor. So we partner with our local agencies to help us do a lot of the land management, like the zoning projects that we work on. So here's a bigger picture of state trust land in the area. You can see the Carefree 50 just right there on Stagecoach Pass Road. I'm going to have a closer up version for you here in a minute. I can show you some recent sales that we have done. So Scottsdale passed a municipal bond election to purchase that McDowell-Sonoran Preserve land. And so they used that bond funding to purchase that. And similarly, the city of Phoenix had, I believe it was a bond, I'm not quite sure how they funded that, but they purchased land within the Sonoran Preserve from us as well. So that land goes fee title over to those agencies, and they purchase that at auction. Potential growth areas we're looking at as an agency, and it's really developer motivated, initiated. The Carefree 50 parcel did have an active application on it about 2 years ago. And then we have some interest in this land, the North Pima Road land in Scottsdale. So let's talk about the Carefree 50. It's zoned for rural zoning 70. That's actually not in compliance with state statute, which says state trust land must be zoned for a minimum of 1 dwelling unit per acre. And according to the zoning map, you can see the Carefree 50 is zoned similarly to a lot of the land surrounding it that's already been developed with residential development. So again, just to show you, we have a parcel viewer online where you can go, I do wish this had a pointer, but you can see the little stacked layers next to the magnifying glass. And if you click on that map, it'll show you, you can see which land is leased, which land is unleased. You could see who the beneficiaries are. If we have rights-of-way easements, we do a lot of rights-of-way, as you can imagine, with our land kind of interspersed as water lines and roads and sewers go through. We have a very busy rights-of-way section. So this is our website if you want to go to our parcel viewer and check that out. Again, this shows you those different layers you can play with. And then we do allow public use of state trust land, but through a recreation permit. And this is the portal to apply for a recreation permit. If you have a hunting license issued by Game and Fish, that enables you to go on to state trust land in appropriate areas and hunt without getting a recreational permit from us. But otherwise, if you want to go do any of these activities, it's necessary to get a recreational permit because there cannot be uncompensated uses of the state trust land according to state statute. So with that, I'll thank you and open it up for questions.
I'll run these around so that we can balance.
Hi, would you give us a brief history of the Carefree 50, what its appraisals have been, are currently, what interest developers had, why the last auction was, as I understood, unsuccessful?
It's just easier if I do it, huh? Unless you want to be Phil Donahue, but, so that, the question I think you all heard, because you were in the mic, thank you. I believe that the last appraisal was in the range of $7 million, I think is what I told you. I can't recall what they had planned to develop it. I think that they were planning, the applicant was possibly planning to rezone it. And I'm not sure why they decided to pull out of that auction. It wasn't unsuccessful, we just simply canceled, we never scheduled the auction. How many auctions, I'm just for the benefit, how many auctions have been scheduled for that parcel? I don't know the answer to that question. Yeah. I did not. But either way, none of them were successful, and the latest appraisal we had was $7 million in that ballpark.
Is there an active plan for that parcel or application for that parcel?
We do not have an active application for that parcel.
What causes it to go to auction? I mean, do you guys choose, hey, I need money, and you choose, or does somebody come to you?
Thank you. That's a really good question. So I'll just step back here so everyone can see me. So I mentioned earlier it's really developer driven when we get an application for a parcel. Sometimes they come in, we really like people to come in and meet with us if they want to apply for our land. And sometimes we don't think that the land is economically ready. You know, if it's going to cause leapfrog development, and if buying that parcel is going to require our buyer to spend a lot of money on infrastructure to the point where they're going to not bid as much as its value, then we don't accept the application. But if this is really kind of like an infill piece, for lack of a better term, right? It's surrounded by development. So, you know, if there was interest in bringing this to auction, and if the buyer demonstrated that they were going to be capable of successfully completing an auction, it would be something that we would entertain as an agency. Let me try to get to everyone here.
So you mentioned that the zoning right now is not, I think you said the word legal, that it needed to be, it's an R70 now, which I think is 1 house per 2 acres, and it needs to be 1 house per 1 acre. I had been reading a little bit about entitlements, which is when I guess like a developer or a town or you come and try to get a zoning that's better to get more money, which is your job. So can you explain a little bit about how the entitlement process works? And then the second question would be, can you help us understand, it's zoned right now for R70, so therefore water is allocated for R70. How does water change, or how do they get water for this area? So the entitlement, how does that work? Has anybody approached you on that yet? And then help us understand water, which I think is allocated only for R70 right now. How does that change?
Thank you. That's a really good question too. So on the entitlement process, we, in some cases, depending on the parcel, we will sell it zoned as is. A lot of placeholder zoning for state trust land around the state is zoned for that one, it's rural res, that 1 unit per acre, because that is what is the statute requirement. And then if we're going to be selling it, we'll go in and rezone it. We are really limited on resources, not just staff resources, but financial resources to run entitlement cases. So oftentimes on parcels that are, you know, there's a lot of active sales in the area, there's a lot of development around it, we will just sell it as is with the appraisal based on the true market value, even as if it were entitled. So the bigger pieces, like the land I referenced earlier where TSMC is, that was a 3,500 acre entitlement project we did with the city of Phoenix. That's more of what, you know, we have the bandwidth internally to focus on. So the bigger parcels that are gonna provide, you know, bigger bang for the beneficiary's buck. So we might hire a firm to help us with that entitlement process, and then we work hand in hand with the local jurisdiction to run that case, just as any other private developer applicant would do.
But nobody's approached you on entitlements yet for Carefree?
No.
Explain entitlement.
So entitlement, the question was to explain entitlement. That really just means entitling the land to certain development rights. So it's getting the zoning done. It's setting up development standards that say, you know, how high the buildings could be or setbacks so that's what entitlement. That land is entitled to develop according to these development standards and these land uses. Oh, the water, yes, thank you. So we basically, when we're not land developers. So we don't deal with the water question as an agency. We do pay attention to what water is available to service our land once it's developed, because frankly, it impacts the value. So that's a really good question, and it would be something we would have to, you know, probably we would just kick to an applicant to figure out with the town to figure out, you know, what the water availability is. But I think that we would appraise it based on the statutory limit of 1 dwelling unit per acre and assume that was water availability. Yeah.
Two things. Does the town of Carefree have the right to refuse an entitlement that somebody asks for? And is the Pima Road land scheduled for auction yet?
Well, the town of, I think technically that we do as a state agency have the right to, we have like super zoning powers but that's not our business and that's not our practice. It is our business to partner with the local jurisdiction. We have land all over the state. You know, that's nothing that I know we have ever done, and it's just not something that we do. I think probably legally there is an avenue for us to do that, but that's not we don't think that that's in our best interest. So, and no auctions.
The Legend Trail land?
The Scottsdale land, yes.
Around Legend Trail?
Yes.
That hasn't been scheduled?
No, there are entitlements on that land. That was a deal we did with Scottsdale when we sold them that land for the open space. So there is currently entitlement on it, but there is no active application on, like, plans to auction that land.
Explain that, I'm confused, because I have a bike ride out in the preserve.
With your rec permit. Oh, in the preserve, gotcha.
We're not talking about the preserve, right? We're talking east of Pima and,
Thank you,
south
Matt.
of Stagecoach.
Can
That
you,
big
that one,
Yeah, the North Pima Road piece.
yeah.
Scottsdale owns that?
The preserve, the yellow.
I'm talking about the blue.
No, Scottsdale does not own the blue.
Has the auction been scheduled?
We do not have any plans to schedule an auction in the near future on that, but that we have had interest in that land.
And does the recent water changes affect?
Well, Scottsdale is a designated water provider. So, and that is in Scottsdale's jurisdiction, and it is entitled within Scottsdale, so it would have water availability at least for what the entitlements are now, which is not just that standard zoning. Yeah, and I want to get over here because I know.
Hi, I just have a question. So, I understand growth to areas, but this is a rural community, and I just wonder if you ever look at some of these parcels of land and think about how it's going to impact the community for the long term. Like, this is supposed to be a rural community where we focus on keeping the environment as it is with the the Sonoran Desert, especially in that 50 parcel. There's over 200 old growth saguaros there. There are a lot of animals that live there. So do you ever like take into consideration the environmental impact that you would have? And plus there's that airport. Like, what are you gonna do if they have planes flying over the houses? I guess I just wonder if you're thinking about all of these other downstream impacts that, sure, you bring in some developers that plow it under. That's great for you because you get money for some schools. But at the end of the day, this is supposed to be a special area, and the Sonoran Desert is one of the most unique places in the world, and only certain types of flora and fauna and animals live here. So I just wonder if you think about those sorts of environmental impacts when you're trying to sell off the land.
So I'll say I'm a third generation Arizonan, and so I appreciate Arizona's unique desert. And we, as I said, we are a fiduciary to this trust. So our sole, just like you want your fund manager to be solely focused on your return, on your investment, we are a fiduciary and we are mandated. Our primary focus is the trust. Now, to your point and to your question, that's why we don't come in and throw our elbows around and just zone land any way we want to maximize revenue. And if the land was sold and developed as it's zoned currently, it would develop under Carefree's development requirements. So if there are natural preservation ordinances, if there are setbacks, if there's open space, all of those requirements that the rest of this community, including probably where you live, have developed under, then that's how this land would develop as well.
So I understand a auction is triggered when a bona fide buyer approaches you with an offer. If that happens and that offer is of appraised value, are you required to accept it? And I recognize that other auctioneer or other investors could come in and look to buy up. But my follow-up question to that would be, who hires the appraiser? Is it you? Is it them? Is it a combination of two? Can you refute, fair market value? Speak to that.
Good questions. So someone doesn't come in and offer us a price. They offer to buy the land, and we have a talk about what you think the land is worth. We, have real estate agents, brokers that work for our department that, they have an idea of what market value is, and if we're kind of in this, because we just don't have the staff to entertain auction applications that aren't gonna go anywhere. So even before an application comes in, we try to talk to them and make sure we're on the same page. So if we are, then we'll start the due diligence, which there's due diligence for every application. It's cultural resource survey. It's a native plant survey for a sale, because the plants are an asset to the trust. And so the trust has to be compensated for those plants. And then there's a phase 1 environmental site assessment, and then there's also an ALTA boundary survey. So just like a boundary survey, basically, with some more details. So the applicant pays those due diligence, which for a parcel this size is probably in the area of 20 or 30,000. Once those are done, we get the land appraised. The appraiser, we have a list. We control the appraisers. And so we have a list of appraisers that we use. We have an appointed citizens committee called our Board of Appeals that reviews each and every appraisal. If it's for a right-of-way easement, if it's for a 1,000-acre land sale, they approve every appraisal. And they have questioned some appraisals, and we've had to go back and get them again. Once that's done, we can decide, set the auction. The commissioner, our state land commissioner, which is an appointed position, has ultimate authority. If the appraisal is, 7,000, and the commissioner thinks the land should be sold for 10 million, 7 million, she thinks that it should be sold for 10 million, she could set that as the opening bid. She has that discretion. It doesn't happen all the time. I don't think it happens that often. But, so once all that's done, then it would be posted up for auction. The auction is 10 weeks advertising in in the paper. And then the auction happens, and if we get bidders, I've been to auctions that have had over 230 bids on them. Sometimes we have a one bid auction. So it just depends on the land. But just because someone, like I said earlier, gives us an application doesn't mean we're gonna accept it and move that forward, because we don't, you know, you may have heard highest and best use. So our job as agency professionals is to decide if if the land is ripe for development, if this is the highest and best use, what the plans are for it. So there's some, you know, professional discretion that we use as an agency to decide if we're gonna accept an application and move it forward. Like, I'm gonna try and get, well, I wanna,
Yeah, I was just gonna say, we're just watching time, we got about 5 more minutes, so we can do a couple more questions, and then we're gonna walk through a few more slides, and then try and break out into conversations to get some specific feedback, but we'll still be available myself to answer questions.
Could you just expand on highest and best use?
Thank you, that was my question, Peter.
okay, expand on highest and best use is just, you know, it's kind of like when I said that the land may be zoned, we might sell it for as unzoned or currently zoned, and the appraiser goes in and that's his appraisal is based on what's all the zoning around it, you know, what does it look like if you go back to the zoning slide, Matt, that'd be great. You know, they would look at that, and the appraiser has a role, I guess it's that, yeah, so they'll kind of look at that. They'll look at other land sales, see what similar parcels are developing as within the jurisdiction. That's kind of how they figure highest and best use.
Isn't that subjective though?
Exactly.
It is a little subjective. Yeah, I mean, this is, you know, there's very little in this world that is a precise.
Your job is, as a trust, to ultimately get or command as much value for your beneficiaries as possible. It makes sense to rezone that land into smaller lots.
Working with the jurisdiction.
Well, but you already told us that Carefree has zoned this incorrectly according to the state. You said that when you opened. So if it's your job would be to make sure that it was rezoned, correct? So they get highest and best use, which is most money for the land.
We would sell it based on what the appraised value use is. So that assumes zoning, and then the buyer buys it sometimes at zoning risk. So they're buying it knowing how we appraised it, what land use we appraised it at, and then sometimes just because I said the zoning cases, we are a very small staff and we have a small budget. And so the zoning process is very expensive. And so we will sell it, and that buyer is buying it at risk that they can work with the town to get it zoned.
If a city has a zoning map that is in conflict with the state, what law supersedes, the state or the city?
The state. So during
That
this
would
process,
automatically be rezoned and-
no, but during this process, I'm gonna talk to Matt, because we get notified when these general plan updates happen. And I'm gonna say, you know, could you change that land use designation so it's reflective of a 1 dwelling unit per acre to comply with statute? And he's gonna take back that back to his clients.
No longer R70.
Well, but that's not zoning, that's a land use. If that's zoned for R70, we have to run a zoning case. We can't just do it through this land use designation. But I'm gonna ask that happens so the expectation is correct. Because sometimes jurisdictions will designate our land as open space. So it's just, you know, I am one of 3 people who are trying to keep up with every zoning, every general plan update across every jurisdiction in the state of Arizona. And a lot of the rural areas don't really understand what we are and how we work, and so we're just doing our best. But yes, I mean, we would try to at least right-size the expectation by dealing with the general plan and a parcel this size, because the other project, I'm working on an 8,000 acre zoning project. That's gonna be better value for our beneficiaries.
I guess my concern is doing your best as a fiduciary to your beneficiaries
or selling it at the appraised value at that assumed zoning. So we're still getting the value, but we're not expending our resources as an agency. We're getting more value for our beneficiaries by expending our very limited resources elsewhere. And this appraisal is going to assume, and the land is going to be sold, and this is going to be a cash sale. This is not 30-year mortgage stuff. This is a cash sale. 30 days after auction is paid for. And
Sorry, I was just gonna jump in here. I know we can probably spend our whole time this evening talking about the state land piece specifically, but again, I need to try and guide us to remember that we're talking general plan overall. And so we want to also make sure we don't get hyper-focused on one parcel, because we're gonna be responsible of thinking about open space overall. I know how important this one piece is, so tonight's not the end of the conversation, but I wanted Karen to come so that you could hear directly from state land, and we can all kind of hopefully be on the same page as to what their process entails, and then we can start exploring some deeper questions or some follow-up questions, and I know Karen will be happy to navigate those with us, but we're not gonna get every answer tonight in terms of how the general plan is going to look at the end of this process. What I wanted to set is the foundation so that we all can start asking even tougher questions maybe. But with that, if there wasn't any other very important aspect to clarify, I wanted to see about moving on. So couple points.
Couple things. Would the state trust ever accept an option on the land? In other words, hey, we'd like to buy, we don't have the money today, but we'd like an option so that okay. And the other thing is, if you don't need the money, are you forced to move forward if a developer shows up and says, I want to do something?
if we don't need the money,
Does the state, like, there was 10 million acres at one time, now there's 9.2. Are you forced to sell with everything that comes in front of you? Or
No.
do you say, hey, we don't need it today, we'll leave it alone for a while?
like I said, no one sues us more than our beneficiaries. So that money is, adding to a growing permanent fund for a growing state that has growing needs. School districts, hospitals, they all have growing needs. And so it's hard to argue that there isn't the need. And if the land is, the market's right, if it's a really slow market, we're probably not going to do a lot of sales, right? And we frankly have a limited staff bandwidth. We can only bring about 20 auctions to, parcels to auction in any given year just because of our staff capacity and how long it takes to get an auction. Like once we get an application, it takes 12 to 18 months to even bring that to auction.
But to follow up on that, if that whole process goes through, and let's say you get the appraisal and everything, you validate it all, $12 million, and someone says, sold, $12 million, here's a check. Are you then required to take that check?
If we bring it to auction, we think it's a piece of land that's sellable, that's at a good market value, and that will benefit the trust. So we are not going to hold an auction unless we think that land is ready to sell. And if someone brings us a check for that first bid, and there's one bid, we're taking the check and we're sending it to the treasurer's office. Yeah.
You guys pay taxes on that check?
This land is not taxed. State trust land is not taxed. So this land sitting here unused, undeveloped, is not bringing any revenue to your jurisdiction.
But it brings revenue to the beneficiaries?
No, unless it's leased. Only if it's leased. And this, I believe, is unleased.
Okay, I'm gonna do one thing. I want Steve has a comment, so I'm gonna collect that one last point, and then we'll transition into the next part of our conversation.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify real quick. There is the general plan does show 1 lot per acre. I'm with the town. I'm sorry, I'm the economic development director of the town. So the general plan does reflect the requirement for the 1 lot per acre. partly because we actually have a land use component to the general plan as it looks to develop, that we would try to seek some type of open space for that particular parcel. The zoning came with the site. That zone, I don't think the town rezoned it. I think it just, when the town became a town, that zoning existed. So I'm pretty sure that's about how that happened. So again, if somebody comes in, they would have to, one, bid at that price, at 1 lot per acre. I think that's where the value would go. But they also would have to rezone it through the town, and then they also have to look at the water situation, which is probably why the applicant that put the application in probably didn't push it through, so.
Thank you for that. And if I could, Matt, one, because you guys have so much more open space than this 48 acres, but when land is annexed into a jurisdiction, it comes with, it's called translational zoning. So if that was zoned in the county, then it came in, or if that, that was just a placeholder, which we have incorrect zoning of our land all over the state. It could be whack-a-mole trying to fix that. But it was likely it was annexed and it came with that translational zoning, and we have 100 years of agency mistakes to learn from. And so we used to annex land without zoning it. We don't do that anymore, and that's probably exactly what happened. Yeah.
Okay. Well, a lot to take in a short amount of time, and if you feel the same as I do, the state land process is very involved. There's a lot of nuances to it, but knowing the amount of comments that we heard about the 48-acre state land piece and where that fits into the overall discussion of open space is something we're going to continue to explore as we develop this general plan. But I wanted everyone to have the benefit of understanding what goes or what is involved in acquiring that piece, whether it is the town or some other entity. There are many steps and there are many issues, I think, to confirm before that piece were to move forward. What my focus for our conversation this evening, though, is to again take a step back and make sure we're not overlooking the big picture, because when we're writing this general plan, I keep hearing from residents about how important open space is and what we need to do to make sure it stays or maintains that level of importance within the community. We need to ask ourselves, what does that look like in the general plan? It's not all about just saving one parcel. It's about how is open space viewed? What is our definition when we say open space is important to us? Are we picturing active recreational uses on some of this open space? Are we picturing passive uses where just walking trails? A lot of nuances go into that we can put in the general plan to guide some of the decision making that we just heard about that may come forward in some fashion in the future. So whatever happens with this state land piece, for example, the general plan needs to have some language in there to guide how we're managing, if you will, the long-term use of that particular property. So we have 3 stations for this evening's conversation. The first station's looking at open space preferences, and I'll show you what that means. Then we're going to talk about mapping and then some policy validation. So when we're looking at station 1, I know this is small text, but in essence, this is where we're getting at what is your preference on open space. We want to get a feel for now where everybody is on this spectrum of viewing open space. So we have a couple scales here to help us identify. The top one is looking at the type and accessibility of open space. So you can see we have natural open space on the left and structured open space on the right. And then you can identify what your view is relative to you strongly prefer one type of open space over the other. We have Post-it notes at that, so you can qualify it. If you say, well, in certain conditions, I favor this open space. In certain conditions, I favor that open space. But the nuance here is, in any general plan, you can go into it and look at open space, and some of it's natural open space. You don't touch it, you don't access it, you just look at it. It's preservation. So that would be that natural open space. But then structured is, yeah, we could structure it to just have passive open space. We could structure it to have active open space. So we want to understand from your perspective, when you say, Matt, we want the general plan to focus on open space, I need to know what you mean by that. So type in accessibility is one. Ownership and management. So when you look at the general plan, you can see different types of open space identified currently. And I've heard from residents of saying, hey, we in the general plan identify something as open space, but it's a golf course, and that's private. Whereas other, like the gardens, is public open space. And so we want to, again, make sure we understand where your mindset is of when you say we want to be focused on open space, where do we fall in terms of public versus private, and knowing that, you know, the Desert Foothills Land Trust is in essence an entity that can help manage open space in certain areas around Cave Creek and Carefree, and they have other lands as well. But then you also have the public open space, like the county Cave Creek Regional Park or Spur Cross are other examples. And then last, as we talked about multiple times, the intensity and the amenities. So we want you to be thoughtful about, is it active open space that we want to see? Is, you know, what is the parking looking at? What is lighting looking at? Compared to passive open space, where it might just be a few ramadas and some kiosks to explain the flora and fauna, but something less impactful, if you will, compared to active open space. So one of the things I've heard up to this point is residents concerned that, hey, you're just asking us these little pinpointed questions, and I read through the general plan, and you know, that has a whole discussion about the type of open space that's comprised in Carefree and how much we need and how we're going to go about getting it. That's what all these questions are for. We don't have the opportunity to go through it page by page with everyone. So we're asking these broader questions so that we can then take that input and help refine all of those other parts that you're saying, yeah, you didn't ask us about this. Well, yes, we're asking you broader questions in order to answer the greater components of the plan overall. So with talking a little bit about open space preferences, I mentioned we want to look at the map itself. And so we have this map in the back of the room. We're going to ask you, are there other places that we should be mindful of when we're updating the general plan beyond just this? Let's see if I can point it out. So as everyone knows, we have the state land, the 48-acre piece here. We have up to the north limits of town, we have 2 parcels here that are owned by the town of Carefree. And we also have a larger parcel here that is owned or managed by the Desert Foothills Land Trust. We also know that we have the Black Mountain Preserve, and even adjacent to the preserve, there are some additional. There's a piece here owned by the county, and another piece here managed by the trust. So obviously those are pretty steep slopes here and even to the north. So those impact what we can and can't do with those particular parcels. But again, I just want to broaden everybody's mindset of what this general plan needs to entail, and it grows beyond just one specific location in town. So then the last piece, and I'll see if there's any questions, But this last piece, again, I know that we've asked in prior meetings, especially our last meeting, to look at specific goals and the policies associated with them. But this is only 2 goals of, I think, the total of 4 that the open space section has. But the thing that we're trying to marry up here is a lot of the feedback I'm hearing when I start looking at these goals and policies and asking residents to comment on them. You know, when we asked residents to comment on the goals overall, we saw on the first slide that everyone supported all 4 of the goals in open space. Well, if you tonight start to look at the policies under all of those goals and you say, well, those policies look pretty solid too, except for maybe word choice here and there, then we have to start again asking ourselves, well, what is it that we don't like about the general plan relative to open space? If the goals and policies are telling us and consistent with our mindset on it, and the map starts to identify areas of interest, then it starts to come of what are our actions, right? How are we actually implementing the general plan as opposed to what the general plan is saying is important? So that's the thing that we're trying to solidify here, is that we hear loud and clear from everyone that open space is important, and so we're ready and prepared to convey that in the general plan. But we also need to ask ourselves, does it really rise to a policy or goal, the issue that we have, or is it actually maybe an action that we need to form a group to go analyze something to then make better decisions in town? Or do we need to go find an appraisal of a property in order to understand what it might cost to acquire a piece of property? So there's a lot of different things that could actually turn into actions as opposed to a specific goal or policy. So those are the 3 broad asks for tonight. Questions? Confused about anything? I'm sure there will be a few, so let's start.
The one thing that's not clear to me in all of this is what assumptions or are you thinking about with regard to blading? So open space, to me, that's a critical issue, and I haven't seen it mentioned anywhere. So are you making certain assumptions for these different categories? And if not, maybe that needs to be factored in terms of what people think. So for instance, the Carefree Gardens was bladed, okay? It has all these pretty cactus, but the desert was bladed. It's in the town core, that's okay. But if we're talking about the state trust land, it's sort of like, what are the issues? How much of that land could be bladed? You know, how does that fit into these different categories of open?
Great. I'm glad you're thinking through those nuances, and so that's very helpful. And what you're speaking to is exactly what we're hoping to get at a deeper level out of this feedback. So if, to your point, we have dots back there, you could say, you know what, I don't care where open space is. Open space to me is preservation, and so I'm all for natural open space. You don't touch it, you look at it, and you appreciate it and love it. But to your point, some might say, yes, in certain areas that absolutely is important, but in some areas, like the gardens, it's urban, I want open space there, but I could see it as something different. So you might grab a Post-it and just say, well, we want structured in specific areas, whether you write town center or wherever else you think it's acceptable. But otherwise, you want natural open space somewhere else, or you can qualify it along that spectrum. So that's what these, if you start to kind of break these down, that's why these 3 categories almost cover the entire range of what you could do with open space, and based off that feedback, we would then know how we would address a question of, well, if we're showing open space in the northern part of town, then we know that it's viewed more as preservation, a passive type of condition, whereas other locations, a bladed approach may be applicable depending on the situation.
So the structured open space where it shows natural land with trails, would the assumption be that Would the assumption be that there's no blading in structured open space other than to make a trail? Or is that picture not representative of all the different things that could go on in structured open space?
The pictures we have shown here are definitely for conversation purposes. So a structured, I mean, you could even jump down to the active and passive open space. Those are technically both structured open space. One is more passive in nature and thus less maybe impactful, whereas the other with ball fields and parking lots and lighting is probably more akin to what you're describing of a bladed condition, and then you come back in and maybe make it look more natural. But that's how, if you were to say you're favoring or prefer a structured open space, you're saying you acknowledge that some man-made improvements would be on that land. Now, the range of that would come down to location and other aspects. I'll start here and then come back.
You had the golf hello. You had the golf courses on there as being open space. Why? I mean, they're not going to, bulldoze that and put houses on it. I'm just kind of curious. You mentioned also, I think in the general plan, it also mentions like swimming pools being counted as open space, which doesn't make any sense.
I don't know if I heard, I don't know if I heard anything about swimming pools, but it's a small map. But in terms of the open space, it's one thing I know we've heard from residents, and so that might come out of tonight is, see these green areas here and here? Those are golf courses, right? And in the current general plan, they're identified as open space recreational. And so that's what I'm getting to, and that's what all those questions are getting to, is maybe an outcome from our conversation is to say, our goals and policies are pretty strong, we're gonna adjust some, but we may wanna look at our open space designations and acknowledge there's different types of open space that the general plan needs to address, as opposed to lumping it all into one category.
Yeah, because that seems pretty developed to me, personally, so, okay.
Yep,
Curious. Thank
you spot on in terms of the
Thanks. So we've obviously been talking about open space on the ground level. I haven't seen anything addressed on like the skyline. And I consider the skyline open space, especially with all the views we have. And I think the vast majority of residents are very concerned with additional Hampton Inns going up and ultimately blocking the skyline. So should that be addressed here in open space, or is that addressed somewhere else in the general plan?
fantastic observation, and thank you everybody for kind of shedding some more light, hopefully on the value of the conversation, is because what you're describing I would view as view sheds, that people want to preserve their view sheds, whether they're on a mountain looking down or on the ground looking up. And I wouldn't classify those as open space. And so that's what another aspect of this conversation tonight is, help us understand where everyone's viewpoint is. So if view sheds are a particular aspect of your thoughts on open space, then we would definitely want to see, for example, on goals and policies of, we have right at the bottom what's missing, then we would want to hear, we don't see anything here talking about view sheds. And then we can take that language and figure out where's the best location in the plan to use that. Do we want to put it in the open space section, or do we want to put it in environmental section? That part, we have some flexibility, and we bring it back to everyone to evaluate. So, perfect comment. Yes.
Matt, will we be allowed to respond to these sections online as we have for previous workshops? And if so, when will that go live?
Great. Very good question. So the short answer is yes. We're just like all our other community workshops for the general plan. These specific stations will be online. I think, yes, if you can give us to the end of the week to make any adjustments based off of, sometimes we may hear hey, you need to explain this a little better. So after tonight, if we have till the end of the week to get that up, and then we'll, the town has a terrific communications manager now, and so we'll coordinate with staff and push that information out when it's available.
Hey, Matt, a simple question in here. Who can access open spaces? Isn't that a very important part of the classification?
So I think I love the fact that everyone's being so thoughtful about the open space conversation. And that's why I think this dialogue's good, because when we're looking at open space and who can access it, that's why we ask. That's why when we get to this, we're talking about public open space or private open space. So within that, you can qualify. You know, public open space is usually available and accessible to the general public, but not in every case. I was just showing a piece on the side of Black Mountain that Maricopa County owns, but they don't necessarily make it accessible. And then private obviously has different layers to it. So that would be something relative to a Post-it note or a clarification on that particular item as to whether you think the public should have general access to it, that it should only be accessible to town residents. You know, a lot of different communities approach their facilities in different ways. So if you have specific thoughts or expectations, that's where I would think it would go.
So, Matt, you're talking about public open space. What are there's only like 3 potential candidates within the city boundaries for public open space, aren't there?
Again, I guess relative to your perception on public open space, that could take on a lot of different forms. I mean, if tomorrow someone were to donate, which has happened to the town in the past, if someone were to donate their land to the town, then the town now owns that land and it could become public open space, depending on what you do with it. So I don't know that I could say today that there's only 3. If we look at a map, there's certain parcels that we believe are the most available in terms of public open space, but there's a lot of different nuances to that that could change that dynamic. Okay, any other questions? So we'll be at each station here, and again, happy to answer more questions and any sidebars. And like last time, I heard a lot of residents say, okay, I'm gonna kind of get the lay of the land, I'll ask you some questions, and then I'm gonna go home and complete this, and that's perfectly fine. One of the things I'll close to at least put a bow on this is I always wanna share with you where we are in the process so that you all understand where we go from here. So in terms of coordination, we have, after tonight's meeting, we do have August 1st, a council work session to brief them on current status of the general plan process and some of the feedback we've heard up to that point. We have a similar meeting with the Planning Commission on August 14th, where we'll be providing them with similar input and updates. But then from a project milestone standpoint, again, everything that we're talking about in our last community workshops and this evening are all leading up to this 60-day review draft that is scheduled to come out in October. So when we get our information, you obviously, we need a little bit of time to actually write it. So we're going to, after our meeting, start getting more concrete proposals out for the draft writing. And the idea is to then have our briefing sessions and those types of interactions to get the draft as far along as we can for that 60-day review period. But the whole purpose of that review period is to give us a chance to refine it. So another thing I share with residents that either send me an email or give me a call is to say, listen, we're going to do the best we can to get as close as we can to this. But if we miss the mark somewhere, that's what the whole 60-day review is. It's not to say that we're stuck with what we have in that document. So just give us the feedback and we'll work on making adjustments. This is an iterative process, and so don't believe that when you see the draft come out and think, man, Matt completely missed it on this one, that that's the way it's going to stay. So we're going to continue to refine it. And then even during that 60-day review period, we have our community workshop number 5 on October 11th, so that we're not just throwing the plan out there and saying, okay, guys, after the 60 days, you let us know what you have. We're going to have a meeting during that period so that you can even let us know in person or ask your questions of, okay, I read it and I don't know where you're going with this, Matt, but you need to explain it to me. So that's a couple of the checks and balances along the way. Again, thank you for coming tonight, and we'll be around to answer any specifics. All right, appreciate it.